firefighter cried as he told me the particulars of the incident, and yet, at every step, I knew there was faith there. I knew there was trust there. There was confidence. We're good people, courageous people. We're going to pick up the pieces and we're going to do what is right. And I don't think I have seen, and I've been in the hospitals, I've been over at Chelsea Piers, I've been at the new school where people were finding out that their relatives were dead. I spent all day yesterday, yesterday morning rather, walking through the dust. I assure you, Mr. Blitzer, the people are figuring it out. They have confidence in their God and they are showing heroism and love. I'm not worried at all about New York or the nation.
Cardinal McCarrick, we only have a little time left, but I think it's your impression, I know it's mine, that even though you couldn't blame anyone for losing their faith at a time when these kinds of horrible tragedies unfold, my sense is people get a stronger bit of faith during these terrible, terrible moments. Is that your impression as well?
I think it's true. I think what His Eminence Cardinal Egan said is so very true, and I commend him for the extraordinary goodness that he's shown the last few days in being with the people. But I think one of the things that appeared to me as something very, very strong was when we were watching these terrible things happening last Tuesday, constantly people who saw what was going on would say, "Oh my God, oh my God." I'm sure in a certain sense that's a cultural response, but it's also more than that. It's also the cry of people who know that they need the Lord and who reach out to him. Because as the Cardinal said so well, they really trust him. We trust the Lord. We Americans have always trusted the Lord. And I think at a moment like this, that happens more clearly, more profoundly, more perfectly. And I see it happening down here in Washington. I'm a New Yorker, so I know that it happens up in New York too. And I think what the Cardinal is saying is absolutely true. The people come at these moments to recognize that even though they are unhappy about what is happening in their lives, yet they know that there is a providence that looks over them and watches them and takes care of them.
I want to thank both of you very much, Cardinal Egan, Cardinal McCarrick. Thank you so much for your words on this evening. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Will. Thank you.
We appreciate it very much. And let's go down to my colleague, Greta Van Susteren, for more. Greta?
Wolf, it has been a day of prayer, as your guests have noticed, and it's been a day of painstaking work. And a couple of hours ago, there was an absolutely incredible show of emotion. As President Bush toured the disaster scene at the World Trade Center, all of the rescue workers began chanting, "USA, USA." Watch and listen.
I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
We'll have more from New York in just a minute, but first let's recap the day's most important developments. Justice Department sources tell CNN an individual has been arrested as a material witness in the terrorist hijacking investigation. U.S. officials tell CNN there are still would-be terrorists inside the United States who may try to attack targets in the country. Some may be trained as pilots. And if that isn't scary enough, officials say there may be other types of threats as well. A well-placed security source tells CNN that Atlanta, Boston, and Richmond, Virginia also were terrorist targets. The only specifics given were tall buildings and sports facilities. While the investigation continues, the nation mourned its dead today. You're looking now at live pictures of a candlelight vigil in Providence, Rhode Island. Similar services are being held around the country. This is a national day of remembrance in honor of the thousands of victims of Tuesday's terror attacks. Former Presidents Ford, Carter, Bush, and Clinton joined President George W. Bush and the Reverend Billy Graham at this noontime memorial service in Washington. The president then went to New York. CNN national correspondent Gary Tuckman joins me from Ground Zero near the World Trade Center with more on the president's visit and the continuing around-the-clock search for victims. Gary, what's going on in New York now?
Greta, it's a fact that's very difficult to comprehend. More than 4,700 people are still missing, and the search continues for each and every one of them right behind me. This is where the World Trade Center used to stand, 4 blocks back there. Now it's a cauldron. Fires continue to burn. The steam continues to billow. Rescue and recovery workers are still on the scene as they've been since Tuesday, 1,000 to 2,000 of them working right now. But the search has been very disappointing. No survivors have been found over the last 2 days. They do continue to find people who perished when the planes crashed through the World Trade Center, but even that has gone very slowly. More than 10,000 tons of rubble have been recovered. That's 20 million pounds. But it hasn't made much of a dent. We look at it, and it still looks much the same. That gives you an idea of how much rubble is there. There was a very special visitor, as you said before, Greta, today. The President of the United States, George W. Bush, came to New York City, and that did raise the morale of the rescue workers, according to the workers we've talked to today. The President of the United States toured the area, got cheers from the rescue workers. They did shout, "USA, USA." He was with the mayor of New York City, the governor of New York State, and also New York's 2 Democratic senators, Charles Schumer, and somebody he knows very well, Hillary Rodham Clinton. And then we saw a very unusual sight. The President of the United States mounting the top of the rubble and talking to all the workers with a megaphone.
America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you.
President Bush arrived at the site shortly after the sun came out after 12 hours of heavy rain. The search is excruciatingly difficult, but it was very, very difficult from 2 a.m. this morning Eastern Time till about 2 p.m. this afternoon Eastern Time. Monsoon-type rain and lots of thunder and lightning. And I have to tell you that thunder was psychologically difficult for many people in this area. It sounded like when the plane slammed into the buildings. The same thing happened in Oklahoma City 6 years ago when they had the implosion of the building. That explosion psychologically scarred many people, and that was the scene. It also slowed down the search dramatically. It was very hard with all the rain, but now they are back to full speed at the site 5 blocks behind me. Greta, back to you.
Gary Tuckman, thank you very much for joining me from Ground Zero in New York. Now for the question everybody wants answered. What's being done to track down the would-be terrorist thugs who may be prowling around this country? That is CNN national security correspondent David Enser's department, and he joins me here in Washington. David, we're hearing reports that there are other would-be targets or would-be terrorists in this country. What can you tell us?
Well, that's right, Greta. U.S. officials are telling me that they have evidence that there may still be some individuals in this country who would like to commit terrorist acts, who are looking for targets. They don't rule out that there may be pilots still in this country, and there are other threats they're also concerned about. They won't go into any more detail than that, but they're forthright about saying that they are very concerned that there still could be terrorists waiting to try and commit terrorism inside this country. And as all this is going on, of course, the president and his aides are trying to figure out how to build a coalition for what they are calling a war. Down the line, the president has acknowledged indirectly in some of what he said today, there is going to have to be military action.
The nation is angry about thousands of innocent deaths. U.S. officials say the evidence so far points to Osama bin Laden's group, and the Bush administration is talking tough.
We will go after that group, that network, and those who have harbored, supported, and aided that network to rip the network up. And when we're through with that network, we will continue with a global assault against terrorism in general.
But if it is bin Laden, how to get at him and his top lieutenants? Some argue for giving Afghanistan's Taliban government an ultimatum. Turn him over or else.
We know where your ministries are. We know where your houses are. We're simply going to obliterate them from the face of the planet.
Bouncing that rubble with a lot of B-52 loads of bombs, I don't think is going to change Afghanistan all that much.
No, say most analysts in and out of government. If you want to roll up bin Laden and al-Qaeda, it is going to take more than bombs. It will take ground troops.
In order for us to preserve America and our way of life, we're going to have to sacrifice American treasure and, unfortunately, in some cases, perhaps some American blood.
It is not just a question of grabbing or killing one man or even 20. There are a dozen or more training camps, U.S. intelligence says, producing more terrorists dedicated to killing Americans.
Revenge alone is not an answer. There has to be a complete eradication and elimination of all the training camps.
And much of bin Laden's base of support is in neighboring Pakistan, through which money from around the Arab world is funneled to the al-Qaeda coffers. It is a treacherous and dangerous area indeed.
If you start moving in ground troops and you're willing to occupy countries for long periods of time, you do change things rather significantly for terrorists. I'm not sure this country is ready to do that, even if it does have a fit of passion right now, and it may or may not make sense for the U.S. to do that in its larger interests.
Bottom line, Greta, U.S. forces possibly could go into Afghanistan and get bin Laden, but that might not end the terrorism.
David, the big issue, of course, in terms of the terrorism is who's paying for it. Bin Laden has an awful lot of money. Is there been an effort to sort of freeze and track his money to sort of at least cut his throat at that point?
Yes, there is indeed. In fact, a number of calls were made today and yesterday by senior officials in the administration, particularly at the State Department, to other leaders around the region, moderate Arab leaders, Pakistani leader and others, saying, look, we know that you've been turning a blind eye up till now to certain payments by wealthy Muslims going to charities and other fronts for the bin Laden organization. That must now stop. You have to decide which side you are on. And U.S. officials are saying, we have ways and means of tracking this, and we will be doing it from now on. We want to see who's on our side. You must pick sides at this point on this matter of money. Greta?
David Enzer, thank you, from Washington. Around the United States, patriotism is the order of the day. Flag sales are way up. Kmart and Walmart together have sold more than 500,000 flags since Tuesday, and the U.S. military is gearing up for whatever orders are coming.
Tuesday, September the 11th, has already been described in various newspapers and publications as the darkest day in American history. I would only say to our adversaries that I would warn to watch carefully, for you're about to see our finest hour in the future.
President Bush also is calling in the reserves. After declaring a state of national emergency, the president authorized the Defense Department to call up as many as 50,000 military reservists for Homeland Defense. Among the people suddenly making new plans are University professor Ann Knabe, who is a reservist in public affairs. She joins me from Milwaukee. In San Antonio, Texas, is Dr. Jerry Greenfield, a reservist and orthopedic surgeon. And here in Washington is Susan Borschel. She's a real estate attorney who would be called up as an intelligence officer. And first to you, do you expect to be called up, and are you ready?
Yes, we're ready to go if indeed we would get the call. At this time, I don't know, but we're set.
Dr. Greenfield, do you expect to be called, and are you ready?
I right now don't know if we'll be called, but I am ready and just await that call.
Susan Borschel, do you expect to be called, and are you ready?
I expect that at some point I would be called, and my family and I are ready for this.
Susan, what have you done to get ready?
I first of all made sure that my children and my husband, who is prior military, have an understanding of the kind of effect that this would have on the family, and I've tried to make sure that all arrangements have been made both at home and at office so that people could step in and it won't cause any or it will minimize the amount of hardship on my family and the folks at the office that will need to cover for me.
Susan, how old are your children?
I have a 9-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son.
And do they understand that you're in the reservists and you may be called up?
Yes, my daughter obviously less so. My son who has shown a fervent sense of patriotism the last couple days, has a very clear understanding.
And do you want to be called up?
It's a difficult time for all of us. I signed a contract. I've been in 15 years, and if called, I'll be set to go. Obviously, it's a stressful time for any reserve family.
Are you scared, Ann?
I have to admit, earlier this week I was frightened with the uncertainty and not knowing what's going on. As the week's gone on, I've gotten much stronger, and just seeing my daughter and the children at her school realizing if I'm called up, I'm fighting for freedom for them and the future of our country.
Dr. Greenfield, what are you doing to get ready?
I've been talking with my staff. My family is well aware of this. Actually, I served in Saudi Arabia and met my wife during Desert Storm, so she's well aware of what happens with the reserves and with call-ups such as this. But my staff at my office, my colleagues that I work with, my partners, are aware that I'm in the reserves and that this is always a possibility with this line of work. So they are prepared to take up the slack, as it were, if I have to go elsewhere to be of service.
Dr. Greenfield, do you have children?
I have 3 children.
And how old are your children?
I have a daughter who's 19 in college at Cal Berkeley, and I have a daughter who's 6 and a son who's 5.
Have you talked to at least the younger two? Do they understand what it means to be in the reserves and be called up?
I think they're a little young to understand what it means to be called up. They understand what it means to be in the reserves only from the standpoint of Daddy puts on a uniform and goes off somewhere every few weeks.
And how do you intend to sort of prepare them if you do get called up? I mean, you are a doctor, and presumably your services might be needed in the worst of conditions.
Well, I think that they know what I do for a living. They know what the military is, and that I work in the military as a surgeon. So they understand that concept, at least at their level. So I don't think it would be a difficult job for them, basically because they've known that for several years now.
Susan, what would you expect your job would be if you're called up?
I would probably report over to the Pentagon and work in the Intelligence Alert Center with the Joint Reserve Intelligence Unit, and I would be doing analytic work of intelligence that comes in to try to help interpret what's going on.
Susan, your reaction to the terrorism on Tuesday?
I'm aghast and greatly saddened by it. I always had thought that I was safe in the United States. And having lived overseas in Europe for 4 years of the last 15 or so, I saw terrorism. I never experienced it, but I saw the impact, and I always felt so safe whenever I came home. So I'm sickened, but I'm also at the same time glad that it seems like the United States and the entire world has united on this. And it's just almost too stunning to discuss what has happened this last week.
Dr. Greenfield, your reaction to what happened on Tuesday, and what do you want the president to do?
My reaction is I was shocked. I heard about this while I was in the operating room actually doing surgery, so I wasn't able to see any of the video or the footage until much later in the day. This is something that I've experienced. I took care of Marines that were injured in Beirut in 1983. I've lived in Germany during times of Baader-Meinhof, so it's disappointing and almost frightening that this comes to the United States, but it happens all over the world. As a soldier, I do what the president says and don't try to tell him what to do. That's what diplomats do.
Dr. Greenfield, do you worry, though? I mean, because of your occupation, do you worry that you're going to be put in the most dangerous situation? Do you worry you're going to die?
I think all of us, if you think about it, worry we're going to die every day when you get on public highways. The unit that I command is a forward surgical team, so it is stationed close to front lines in a conventional war. And this type of a conflict, there are no front lines, so everyone is at risk, whether you're in this country or whether you're abroad. So I think that everyone has a certain amount of fear that you accommodate to.
And any second thoughts about whether you should have gone into the reserves or not?
I've never had a second thought about it. it's one of the best things in my life, and I'm extremely fortunate to have family and employer that backs me 100% with my commitment.
And your reaction, Ann, to the terrorism on Tuesday when you heard it?
It was very difficult for me to teach. In fact, I heard it going into school. I ended up canceling my afternoon class and going out to my reserve base to do some volunteer duty. It's just horrific, just terrible.
Susan, any second thoughts about whether you should have gone to the reserves sort of on the eve of perhaps getting called back into duty?
No, I've never had any doubts that what I did was right. I served on active duty. I actually was reservist first. I requested active duty, served for 11 years, and when I came out, I asked specifically for reserve duty when that would not have been mandatory for me, and I think that it's been always an honor to serve the country. I've enjoyed every assignment. I've enjoyed the people I've worked with and the places I've traveled. I regret that I may have to serve again under such ugly circumstances, but I have never regretted being in the reserves. It's been great for me and my family.
And a special thanks to my three guests tonight, Ann Kenobi, Jerry Greenfield, and Susan Borchell, and of course all the other reserves out there. We've heard it again and again. The fight against terrorism is America's new war. But is this a war like our parents and our grandparents fought? CNN's senior analyst Jeff Greenfield is in New York with some thoughts on our national response to this crisis.
Thank you, Greta. We've just heard from three people who know full well what their response might be, but what about the rest of us? I mean, think about it. From the long lines at the blood banks, to the flags that have blossomed everywhere, to the declarations of strength, Americans are trying to find ways to say we'll stand together, we'll respond. But the harder question is, how?
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
from the moment Franklin Roosevelt declared war, American men rushed to enlist. And the home front swung into action as well. Women and children collected rubber. Civilians gave blood, scrap metal.
And you have wisely loaned money to your...
They bought bonds to fund the war. They painted their windows to foil an enemy air attack. And they rationed everything from food to gasoline, all in pursuit of the unconditional surrender of clearly defined enemies.
Okay, it's an A card, 3 gallons.
There was also a less noble side to our response. Japanese Americans were interned in camps.
Some among them were potentially dangerous.
They were targeted for abuse. In the first days after Pearl Harbor, major magazines aired features like this one, How to Tell Your Friends from the Japs. 45 years after World War II, the Gulf War brought a different kind of response. No draft, no home front discomfort, but a broad national show of support. And we knew what to do after the Oklahoma City bombing. The national mourning, the shared grief, exactly the right responses to a single spasmodic act of madness. But what now? Do we rush to enlist? Do we draft our young to go to war? And if so, against whom? Do we share domestic home front discomfort and rationing? Do we need to? And what happens when the grieving ends, knowing that there really is no closure here, but the apparent beginning of a struggle without borders and with any clear conclusion? Greta and Wolf, you can see what the dilemma is. The spirit in this country is absolutely clear. People want to help, they want action, they want to respond, but it's up to our national leadership to tell us how, in what must be not only one of the most difficult times in American history, but one of the most confusing.
Jeff, stand by for a second. We have some late-breaking news that Jamie McIntyre has learned from Pentagon sources that at least 4 U.S. Air Force jets scrambled to intercept the planes that hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, but they arrived too late to intercept those 2 flights. So that's what CNN has learned from the Pentagon. Let's bring Wolf Blitzer back into this discussion. Wolf, obviously almost terrifying news to learn that the Pentagon and the World Trade Center is a little bit too late with those fighter pilots to intercept those 2 flights.
You know, there's so much of what's happening right now, Greta, reminds me of the buildup to the Gulf War, Operation Desert Shield, Operation Desert Storm. We have one picture I hope we have. It's a video of the U.S. hospital ship, the Comfort, which has now moved up the Atlantic coast towards New York City. Here it is with those huge red crosses on there. I remember when I was a Pentagon correspondent in 1990, 1991, that was one of the first ships that was deployed from the east coast of the United States, not up the coast, but towards the Persian Gulf, eventually wound up in the Persian Gulf. It was preparing for an enormous number of U.S. casualties that were anticipated in the ground war and the air war. Fortunately, at that time, those casualties did not materialize. Once again, we're seeing the USNS Comfort involved in a military type of situation. And Jeff, I just want to get a sense from you. My sense is that this upcoming war against terrorism is not going to be as short as the Gulf War was. It's going to be a lot longer than that.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, there are 2 points about that. The war was once again against a very clearly defined enemy in a very conventional situation, an aggressor who had invaded another country. The task was clear, and happily for the United States and its allies, it was, if not cost-free, far less costly than we thought. Here you have a situation of a war, if that's what this is, a war on our own soil for the first time since the Civil War, when we've already seen the kind of casualties that no one would have dreamt possible in some kind of conflict 4 days ago, and where if, in fact, the task is to root out nests of terrorists who are in how many countries, Wolf? Half a dozen, we don't know. That is a long twilight struggle indeed.
You know, Jeff, it's interesting. 4 days ago, this was such a divided city, Washington. Republicans versus Democrats. There's going to be a big fight over the budget. And suddenly, with one act of terrorism, you know, it's been such a unifying, you know, everyone walking together. It's such a different city here, Jeff.
Indeed, Greta and Wolf, it seems to me it's a very good way of looking at how different a country it is, in that once the Cold War ended, I think we felt not only that we were at some kind of end of big historical events, but that we were free to pursue essentially inconsequential stuff. I mean, our newspapers were filled with what were the top grossing movies. Our television was who would be voted off an island or who would be voted out of some house. It seems so astonishingly trivial. That was actually what we had won after 50 years of the Cold War, the right not to think very seriously about the world. At least we thought we had that right. And it is quite clear now that we are not going to be in that situation for a very, very long time, if indeed ever.
Wolf, I'm curious. You covered the Pentagon for CNN during the Gulf War, and now here you are, maybe we're going to war now. What's the difference?
The difference, this is a much different kind of war. That was a war to liberate Kuwait, and the U.S. military had a plan. They knew how to execute it. They had an enormous amount of coalition partners who were ready to get involved. This is a much more amorphous kind of war. You're not exactly sure where the enemies are. You're not exactly sure who they are, and you're not exactly sure how to fight this kind of war. It's a whole learning experience for the U.S. military, and it's going to be a long, drawn-out struggle. I have no doubt about it. Past few days I've spoken to numerous U.S. officials, intelligence officials, military officials, and they themselves are just trying to put together a plan.
I would make
Greta,
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
Just one quick point. Up. World War II came at the end of a depression that was 10 years long. Americans had endured hard times before that war ever began. We are coming off basically decade after decade of a very peaceful and prosperous existence. And I think that makes the challenge all the greater.
And of course, everyone's very angry.
Very angry. Just to put a little perspective on that $40 billion appropriation, emergency appropriation, that was approved unanimously by the U.S. Congress today. I don't believe anyone even mentioned that it might tap into the Social Security surplus.
And I think the president first wanted $20 billion, and didn't they up it to $40 billion on the Hill?
All right, Greta Van Susteren and Jeff Greenfield, thank you so much. Once again, CNN's coverage of America's new war continues. In just a minute with Larry King Live. We'll also be here over the weekend, keeping track of the events in New York, Washington, and indeed around the world. From Washington, I'm Wolf Blitzer.
And I'm Greta Van Susteren. We leave you with another of today's unforgettable moments. President Bush and his White House predecessors at today's National Memorial Service in Washington.